After 20 years of marriage, wife's cheating with new BF lead to its collapse. She is now overwhelmed with regret and left with nothing, seeking for forgiveness. Melissa sat in the dimly lit corner of her living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. She gazed out the window, lost in thought. Tonight, like many nights before, she found herself reflecting on the past, on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 20 years ago, Melissa and Carlo had promised each other forever. Those days had been filled with laughter, dreams, and a sense of adventure. She remembered the way Carlo's eyes sparkled with excitement as they planned their future together, the warmth of his hand in hers as they envisioned a life filled with love and happiness. But as the years passed, the sparkle had dimmed. Their conversations, once filled with eager anticipation for the future, had dwindled to mundane exchanges about groceries and bills. The vibrant colors of their early years together had faded into the monochrome of routine. Melissa longed for the passion they once shared, for the connection that seemed to have slipped away with the passing of time. Sighing, she turned away from the window and looked around the room. It was a beautiful house, a testament to the life they had built together, but it felt empty somehow, devoid of the warmth that once permeated its walls. Carlo was often late from work these days, and when he was home, his presence felt distant, as if his mind were miles away. Melissa couldn't remember the last time they had shared a meal without the distraction of phones or the TV. The silences, once comfortable and intimate, now hung heavy between them, filled with unspoken words and unresolved tensions. She missed the ease of their early years, the way they could talk for hours about everything and nothing at all. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, Melissa heard the front door open and close. Carlo was home. She listened to the familiar sounds of his footsteps, the rustling as he hung up his coat, the soft clink of his keys on the table. But tonight, these sounds didn't bring her the usual comfort. Instead, they were a stark reminder of the distance that had grown between them. Carlo entered the living room, offering a tired smile. "Hey," he said softly, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "Hi," Melissa replied, managing a small smile. They exchanged a few words about their day, the conversation superficial and strained. Melissa wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap that had formed between them, but she didn't know how. The words she longed to say remained unspoken, trapped behind a wall of fear and uncertainty. Later, as they prepared for bed in their shared yet lonely room, Melissa lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness, the sense that something vital was missing from their lives. She loved Carlo, but love alone didn't seem to be enough anymore. Melissa turned to look at Carlo, his face peaceful in sleep. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his arm. He stirred but didn't wake. In that moment, Melissa made a decision. She needed more than this, more than the routine and the silence. She craved passion, excitement, something to break the monotony of their existence. As she drifted off to sleep, a plan began to form in her mind, a dangerous and thrilling idea. She didn't know it then, but that night marked the beginning of a journey that would change everything. It was the start of a path that would lead her away from the safety of her marriage and into the unknown, a path filled with both heartache and discovery. Melissa stepped into the bustling coffee shop, the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans enveloping her as she made her way to the counter. It was her escape, a small haven where she could lose herself in the hum of life around her. As she waited for her order, her gaze wandered over the crowd, landing on a man sitting alone at a corner table. He was absorbed in a book, his dark hair falling slightly over his forehead. There was something about him, a certain allure that Melissa couldn't quite place. With her coffee in hand, Melissa found a seat not too far from the mysterious stranger. She tried to focus on her own book, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. Finally, as if sensing her gaze, he looked up and their eyes met. There was a brief moment of connection, a spark, before Melissa hastily looked away, her cheeks warming with a blush. Days turned into weeks, and the coffee shop became a regular part of Melissa's routine. Each visit brought with it the hope of seeing him again, and more often than not, he was there. Their exchanges began with polite nods and shy smiles, gradually evolving into small talk. His name was Chris, and he had a way of speaking that made Melissa feel like she was the only person in the room. Chris was different from anyone Melissa had known. He was adventurous, speaking passionately about his travels and experiences. He listened intently when she spoke, making her feel heard in a way she hadn't felt in years. With every conversation, Melissa found herself more drawn to him, a feeling of excitement growing inside her. One rainy afternoon, as they shared a table, Chris's hand brushed against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. He apologized with a smile, but neither of them moved their hands away. There was an undeniable chemistry between them, a magnetic pull that neither could ignore. As they left the coffee shop together, Chris invited Melissa for a walk. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and the streets glistening. They walked side by side, talking and laughing, the city around them fading into a blur. Melissa felt alive, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The walk led them to a quiet park, where they sat on a bench under a canopy of trees. The conversation turned more personal, and Melissa found herself opening up about her life, her marriage, and the loneliness she felt. Chris listened, his eyes never leaving hers, and in that moment, Melissa felt a connection deeper than she had ever experienced with Carlo. As the evening drew to a close, Chris walked Melissa to her car. There was a moment of hesitation, a silent question hanging in the air between them. Then, impulsively, Chris leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle, tentative kiss, but it set off a fire inside Melissa. She drove home that night, her mind racing with thoughts of Chris. She knew what she was doing was dangerous, a betrayal of her marriage. But the excitement and passion she felt with Chris were intoxicating. She was drawn to him, like a moth to a flame, and she couldn't resist the urge to see him again. As Melissa lay in bed that night, she realized that her life was about to change. She was standing at a crossroads, and the path she was about to take was fraught with risk and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, she felt alive, and she knew there was no turning back. The world outside Melissa's window was bathed in the golden hues of early autumn, but the beauty of the season couldn't penetrate the turmoil brewing inside her. Over the past few weeks, her clandestine meetings with Chris had evolved into a whirlwind of emotion and passion. Each stolen moment with him was a sharp contrast to her life with Carlo, a life that now felt more distant than ever. Melissa clung to the exhilaration of her affair with Chris, a lifeline in the sea of her monotonous routine. Their conversations, their laughter, the way he looked at her, it all made her feel desired and alive. But beneath the surface of these euphoric meetings, a nagging doubt began to grow, a whispering fear that what she was doing was not only wrong but perilously fragile. Then, the unexpected happened. The text messages from Chris became less frequent, his responses shorter. The long, engaging conversations they once had were replaced by polite, non-committal exchanges. Melissa felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. Something was changing, and she couldn't deny it. One chilly evening, as they sat in their usual spot at the coffee shop, the air between them felt charged with unspoken words. Chris's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and his usual enthusiasm seemed forced. Melissa's heart raced with apprehension as she broached the subject. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris hesitated, then looked away. "I've been thinking," he started, his words slow and deliberate. "We've had fun, Melissa, but I think it's time we both moved on." The words hit Melissa like a physical blow. She felt her world tilt, the ground beneath her shifting. "Moved on," she echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief and hurt. Chris nodded, avoiding her gaze. "I'm not looking for anything serious, and I think it's best we end this before it gets too complicated." Too complicated. The phrase echoed in Melissa's mind, a cruel reminder of the reality she had chosen to ignore. She had risked everything for this affair, for the feeling of being wanted, and now she was left with nothing but the bitter taste of rejection. The drive home was a blur. Melissa's thoughts were a chaotic mix of anger, shame, and heartache. She had been so consumed by the excitement of her affair with Chris that she hadn't seen the truth. It was never going to last. She had allowed herself to believe in the illusion of a new beginning, only to have it shatter into pieces. Sitting alone in the dark, Melissa realized the full extent of what she had done. She had jeopardized her marriage, betrayed Carlo, for a fleeting romance that had left her more alone than ever. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, a burden she could no longer ignore. That night, as she lay in bed next to Carlo, Melissa felt the distance between them more acutely than ever. She turned to look at him, his features softened in sleep, and felt a surge of regret. In her pursuit of something more, she had lost sight of what she already had. Melissa knew that the days ahead would be filled with difficult decisions and painful truths. She would have to confront the consequences of her actions and face the reality of a life that was forever altered. The illusion had shattered, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a life she had once cherished. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room where Melissa lay awake, her thoughts a turbulent sea. The aftermath of her affair with Chris weighed heavily on her, each moment a reminder of her betrayal. She knew she couldn't keep this secret buried. The truth was a specter haunting her every step. After Carlo left for work, the silence of the house echoed the turmoil in Melissa's heart. The walls that had witnessed 2 decades of their life together now stood as silent judges to her infidelity. With a heavy heart, Melissa realized that the time had come to face the consequences of her actions. Today, she would confess everything to Carlo. As the clock ticked towards evening, Melissa's anxiety grew. She rehearsed her confession 1,000 times, yet the right words eluded her. How could she explain the unexplainable? How could she justify the unjustifiable? Her heart raced as she heard Carlo's car pull into the driveway. Carlo entered the house, his face weary from the day's work. He smiled at Melissa, a routine gesture, unaware of the storm brewing. After dinner, as they sat in the living room, Melissa's hands trembled. The moment had arrived. "Carlo, we need to talk," she began, her voice barely a whisper. Carlo turned to her, his expression changing from tired contentment to concern. "What's wrong?" he asked. Melissa took a deep breath. "I've done something terrible," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I had an affair." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Carlo's face drained of color, his eyes reflecting a mix of shock, hurt, and disbelief. "An affair," he echoed, his voice a mix of pain and anger. "With whom? Why?" Melissa recounted the story, her words tumbling out in a flood of regret and sorrow. She told him about Chris, about the loneliness and longing that had driven her to seek solace in someone else's arms. She spoke of her guilt and the realization of her mistake. Carlo listened in silence, his face a mask of stoic hurt. When Melissa finished, the room was heavy with the weight of her confession. Carlo stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "I need some time to process this," he said, his voice hollow. He walked out of the room, leaving Melissa alone with her guilt and fear. That night, the house felt colder, emptier. Melissa lay in bed, the space next to her a stark reminder of the rift that now lay between them. She had confessed, but the catharsis she had hoped for was replaced by a deep sense of loss. She realized that her confession was not just an admission of guilt, but also an acknowledgement of the potential end of her marriage. In the days that followed, Carlo and Melissa lived like strangers under the same roof. Conversations were brief and functional, the emotional chasm between them widening with each passing day. Melissa grappled with the consequences of her actions, the reality of potentially losing Carlo forever a constant shadow. As Melissa faced each day, she understood the arduous journey of redemption that lay ahead. She had shattered the trust that was the foundation of their marriage, and now she had to face the daunting task of rebuilding it, piece by painstaking piece. The road ahead was uncertain, but Melissa knew that whatever the outcome, she had to face it with courage and honesty. The ruins of her actions lay before her, and it was time to confront them, no matter how painful the process. The world outside continued its relentless march forward, but within the walls of the home that once symbolized love and unity, time seemed to have come to a painful standstill. Melissa moved through her days in a daze, each moment steeped in regret and sorrow. The house, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, now echoed with the silence of a love lost. Carlo, though still present in body, had become a ghost of the man he once was. His eyes, which used to light up at the sight of Melissa, now glanced past her, cold and distant. Conversations were strained, limited to necessities, the warmth that once defined their interactions replaced by a chill that permeated the air. Melissa's confession, rather than bringing relief, had unleashed a torrent of pain and guilt that she struggled to navigate. She had hoped for forgiveness, for a chance to rebuild the shattered pieces of their marriage, but as days turned into weeks, it became clear that some breaks were beyond repair. Her affair with Chris, once a thrilling escape, now haunted her as the biggest mistake of her life. The memories of their time together, which used to bring her joy, now served as a cruel reminder of what she had lost. Chris had moved on, leaving Melissa to grapple with the fallout of their brief liaison. As she wandered through the empty rooms of her house, Melissa was struck by the profound sense of loss that enveloped her. Photographs on the walls, souvenirs of happier times, seemed to mock her with their frozen smiles. The future she had once envisioned with Carlo, filled with love and companionship, had dissolved into a distant dream. Melissa's attempts to reach out to Carlo, to bridge the chasm between them, were met with polite indifference. The man she had loved for 2 decades, the father of her children, had become a stranger, his heart closed off to her apologies and pleas for reconciliation. The realization that she had irrevocably damaged the most important relationship in her life was a burden too heavy to bear. Melissa's nights were sleepless, her mind a whirlwind of what-ifs and if-onlys. She replayed their last happy moments over and over, wishing she could turn back time, make different choices. Her friends and family, aware of the situation, offered support and counsel, but Melissa found little comfort in their words. The pain she had inflicted on Carlo, on her family, was a wound that she alone had to bear. In the solitude of her heartache, Melissa came to understand the true cost of her actions. She had sought excitement, a break from the monotony of her marriage, but in doing so, she had lost everything that truly mattered. Her affair had not been a new beginning, but an end to a chapter of her life that she now desperately wished she could rewrite. As the reality of her new life without Carlo settled in, Melissa was consumed by a deep sense of regret. She had thought she was seeking happiness, but in her pursuit, she had destroyed the very foundation of her joy. The echoes of her choices reverberated through her empty home, a constant reminder of the love she had forsaken. Melissa's story was not one of redemption or rebuilding, but a somber tale of loss and the enduring consequences of a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a lesson in the fragility of trust and the irrevocable nature of certain choices. As she gazed out of her window at the world moving on without her, Melissa was left with nothing but the echoes of her regret, a haunting melody of what could have been.